Hey, I'm Nathan Cole. Today, we're getting into some of the most disturbing world record deaths that, if I'm being honest, are pretty hard to stomach. Literally. From a man who thought he could handle eating dozens of live cockroaches until his body said stop, to a cliffside jump, planned down to the inch that still fell apart in seconds. It was October 25, 2013, at a convention hall in Orlando, Florida. A retired electrician sat at a folding table, a bin of live cockroaches in front of him, and $1,000 on the line. And I'm telling you right now, this is one of those stories where nothing about it feels like it should end the way it does. But it does. His name was Beaumont Hargrove. Everyone called him Beau. He was 62, broad-shouldered, the kind of guy who double-checks everything. Once is never enough. 31 years as an electrician, quiet life, routine. But behind that, things were slipping. His wife, Donna, was on dialysis, and they were falling behind on the mortgage. So when he heard about a cockroach eating contest built around breaking an unofficial consumption record with a cash prize attached, he didn't see a stunt. He saw a solution. He told Donna he had a job interview. The event took place inside a Reptile Expo annex, built around an unofficial record attempt. Who could consume the highest number of cockroaches within a fixed time limit? No medical staff, no real controls. Just 4 contestants, a bin of live Madagascar hissing cockroaches, and a crowd treating it like entertainment. The roaches were large, constantly hissing. People laughed. Even Beau smiled at the start. But he didn't go in blind. He treated it like something beatable. He practiced, timed himself, built a rhythm. Grab, compress, chew, swallow. And for a while, it worked. Witnesses said he looked mechanical. The crowd counted each one out loud, tracking his total as it climbed closer to what organizers had marked as the record to beat. Around cockroach 58, he reached for water and began to slow. Just small changes. Blinking more. Slight hesitation. Nothing obvious. Unless you're looking back, trying to find the moment it slipped out of his control. And I'll be honest, I don't even understand how he managed to get that far, because most people would have tapped out after 1, maybe 2, but Beau had already pushed past 70, putting him right up against the highest count anyone there had managed before. At cockroach 71, that's when everything begins to shift, as a piece of rigid exoskeleton catches sideways in his throat, mid-swallow, not fully blocking his airway, but just enough to interfere, with his gag reflex and swallow reflex triggering at the same time, causing the fragment to lodge near his airway until the problem here becomes clear, which is that it's only a partial blockage. And this is where it becomes dangerous in a way people don't usually expect, because a full choke is obvious and people react immediately, but a partial blockage produces something far more deceptive. A strained, wet wheeze that, in a loud room filled with laughter and noise, especially coming from someone who used to perform on stage, doesn't read as distress, but instead comes across as part of the act. Beau lifts his left hand outward toward the crowd, and instead of concern, the reaction is louder cheering. And this is the part I keep coming back to, because his right hand continues moving as he grabs more cockroaches. 3 more. And I honestly don't know if that was a conscious decision to keep going, or if his body was simply following the pattern while his brain was already struggling from lack of oxygen. At cockroach 74, he gasps, and that single involuntary inhale pulls a second roach directly into his airway, which is the moment everything becomes a full blockage. The wheezing sound stops completely. And what really stands out to me is that no one reacts right away, because for about 4 seconds, the room just continues as if nothing has changed, with one person later saying they thought he had already won and was leaning back intentionally, while even the MC continues speaking into the microphone. Then his chair tips backward, and he doesn't put his hands out to catch himself, and by the time people finally understand what's happening, the window to reverse it has already closed. The forensic analysis is straightforward but harsh, confirming that his airway was completely blocked, with insect fragments and 1 intact roach found lodged in his upper airway, while his lungs showed inflammation from aspirated material, and the obstruction became fatal due to oxygen deprivation, despite no underlying health conditions. The contest ended immediately, with no prize money awarded, and within months, the expo shut down while the sponsor quietly removed their branding, which to me shows they understood how serious this was almost right away. Donna found out that same evening when a detective came to her door, and not long after, she lost the house. And when I look at this case, it doesn't feel like a reckless stunt. It feels like a man trying to solve a real problem, stepping into something with no safety net once it started going wrong. At the end of it, he was just trying to keep the lights on. And just like that, something meant to be endured becomes something the body can't quietly recover from. Because the next case shows what happens when pressure isn't as evenly spread as it seems. It was June 18, 2016, in Davao City. By late afternoon, a large crowd had gathered around a temporary stage set up in an open field. Local officials were there, cameras were out, and a small panel stood near the stage to observe and document the attempt, as the whole thing had been introduced as a world record attempt, measured by how many motorcycle passes he could endure across the board. Ramon Villanueva, 34, wasn't some extreme performer. He was a farmer from a nearby rural area, used to hard physical work and long days in the sun. People described him as strong, steady, and the kind of person who just pushed through discomfort without complaining. That mindset carried into what he started doing on the side. Simple public demonstrations. His bed of nails stunt was one of them. He had done it many times, showing how spreading weight across many points could keep the body safe. And honestly, I get why it gave him confidence. When something works every time, it starts to feel less like a risk and more like a guarantee, even when it isn't. But this time, he wanted more, planning to have motorcycles ride across him while he lay on the board. It sounded simple, but it wasn't. Earlier that day, Ramon tested the setup by lying on the board himself. It held. The pressure felt even. Nothing seemed out of place, and I get why that was enough for him to move forward. But that test didn't include what was coming next. Multiple motorcycles, repeated passes, and a heavier and repeated load than the setup had been tested for. There was no reinforced base, no protective layer, and no medical team standing by. Everything depended on balance, timing, and the assumption that the setup would hold under repeated load. When the time came, Ramon lay down carefully across the nails, adjusting his position before signaling that he was ready. People leaned in closer, phones raised, while a staff member near the stage kept count of each pass out loud, marking the number as it climbed. The first motorcycle moved forward and passed over him. For a second, everything worked. The weight spread out, the nails held, and Ramon stayed steady. From the outside, it looked smooth, just like his earlier demonstrations, and with each successful pass, he moved closer to the number organizers had set as the record to beat. Then the next motorcycle came, and another after that. Each pass added more movement, more vibration into the board beneath him. It wasn't obvious. You couldn't really see it happening, but small changes were building with every pass, and the system was slowly shifting away from what it had been at the start. Ramon stayed still, controlling his breathing, trusting the same principle that had always worked. But this time, the conditions were different. When the heavier motorcycle moved across the lower part of the board, something changed. The surface dipped slightly to one side. It wasn't a full break. It wasn't even something the crowd would notice. But it was enough. The weight stopped spreading evenly. It concentrated into one area along his lower back, and several nails pressed deeper than they were supposed to. Ramon reacted right away. His body tensed, and one arm shifted slightly. From where people stood, it still looked like part of the act. Another motorcycle had already started moving. By the time people close to the stage realized something was wrong, the damage had already been done. The board was no longer stable, and the deeper punctures had already caused internal injury. Ramon was still conscious, but struggling to breathe, as his wife signaled for everything to stop, and people rushed in to help. There was no medical team ready. Paramedics arrived several minutes later and began treatment, but his condition kept getting worse. The wounds appeared minor at first, small punctures with little visible bleeding, but deeper tissue damage had already caused internal bleeding that wasn't immediately visible. As time passed, his blood pressure dropped. His breathing weakened, and he began showing signs of shock, pale skin, confusion, and reduced response. During transport, he lost consciousness. He was pronounced dead later that evening. The medical findings confirmed the cause of death as hemorrhagic shock from deep puncture injuries to the lower back, with internal bleeding that was not immediately detected and worsened. Over time, what looks controlled from the outside often depends on balance you can't actually see. And in the next story, that balance shifts in a way no one notices until breathing itself becomes the problem. It was June 18th, 2016, in Kyiv, Ukraine. An outdoor summer fair had drawn a large crowd, where a live demonstration built around control was introduced as a world record attempt, measured by how many lit cigarettes could be held at once, with staff tracking the count. From a distance, it looked safe, but the moment control slipped, there was nothing holding it together. Vasyl Kovalenko was 34, a physical education teacher from Kyiv's Obolon district. He lived a steady life, worked with kids, and on the side, he performed small public demonstrations. Nothing extreme. His focus was on showing how the body can handle discomfort when things are done carefully. And I can't ignore the irony in that. Someone teaching physical health while building a stunt around something, that works against it. One of his known tricks involved holding lit cigarettes between his lips at the same time. It wasn't about strength, it was about control. He would keep them steady, manage his breathing, and remove them before the heat and smoke built up too much. He had done it many times, and it always followed the same pattern. But this time was different. This wasn't just a performance, it was a world record attempt. The goal was to go far beyond what he had done before, pushing the number past what organizers had set as the highest count achieved in previous attempts. Instead of holding a small group, the plan was to pack a large bundle of cigarettes tightly together and light them all at once as a single controlled stunt. Earlier that day, he practiced with a smaller number, around 10. It worked. He kept his breathing steady, held them in place, and removed them cleanly. But scaling it up changed everything. By the time the live demonstration started, number had increased dramatically. More than 50 cigarettes were prepared and packed together into a tight cluster before being lit and positioned at once. That changed the conditions immediately. There was far more heat, far more smoke, and almost no room left to adjust if anything shifted. Once they were in place, stopping quickly became much harder. He stood in front of the crowd, leaned slightly forward, and began, as a staff member near the stage counted each cigarette aloud while the number was confirmed. At first it worked. The cluster held together. The burn looked even. His breathing stayed controlled in short, careful pauses. From the outside, it looked steady, like everything was under control. But as the cigarettes burned down, things started to change. The tips shortened. Ash formed unevenly. Parts of the bundle began to shift slightly out of line. Small changes, but enough to affect how the heat and smoke moved through the cluster. One cigarette slipped deeper, then the others. Instead of the smoke spreading outward, more of it started going straight into his mouth. At the same time, the heat concentrated in one area instead of staying even. He tried to adjust, but with that many cigarettes packed together, even a small movement made the others shift more. One of the lit ends pressed further inside, touching soft tissue. The smoke became thicker and harder to manage. His breathing pattern broke, and this is where everything goes wrong. He tried to pull them out, but not all at once. Some dropped, others stayed stuck. The removal wasn't clean, and during those seconds, he inhaled a heavy amount of hot smoke directly. From the crowd, it didn't look serious at first, but up close, people saw the change. He stepped back. His posture dropped. He was coughing, struggling to breathe. By the time the cigarettes were fully removed, he was already in distress, his airway irritated, breathing uneven and getting worse. Emergency services were called, but there was no medical team on standby. People nearby tried to help until paramedics arrived minutes later, but his condition kept worsening. The heat and dense smoke had already caused severe thermal injury to his airway, leading to rapid swelling that made breathing increasingly difficult. During transport, the swelling progressed further, critically restricting his airway, while inhaled heat and smoke impaired his lungs and oxygen exchange. He lost consciousness before reaching the hospital and was pronounced dead later that evening. The medical findings confirmed the cause of death as severe inhalation injury with thermal burns to the upper airway, leading to rapid laryngeal edema and respiratory failure. The record attempt was halted immediately. Local authorities reviewed the event's safety conditions, focusing on the lack of medical support and risk controls, but no formal charges were filed. The demonstration was not attempted again. Before the next case, if you're into the most disturbing world record deaths, where control slips without warning, consider subscribing. Now let's move on. It was November 11, 2017, in Arlington, Texas, on an auxiliary field. The setup looked like a halftime showcase, but this wasn't just for display. It was a coordinated attempt to set a local record for the tallest multi-team human pyramid, measured by total vertical height and number of active tiers, with officials on site marking each completed level. Daniel Reyes was 51, a former structural engineer from the Dallas-Fort Worth area. He had spent years analyzing load distribution, stress points, and failure patterns in real buildings. After losing his job, he shifted into coaching, bringing that same mindset into high school acrobatics. People trusted him because he didn't treat it like a stunt. He broke things down, how weight transfers, where balance fails, and how small misalignments can escalate. He wasn't guessing. He understood exactly how a structure like this could break. That day's goal was specific: reach 8 stable tiers and hold it long enough for verification. A volunteer official stood off to the side with a measuring pole and a checklist, calling out each completed level as athletes climbed into position. Multiple schools had joined, but many of the athletes had never trained together as a single unit. The base layers locked in first. Dozens of athletes formed a wide foundation, bracing shoulders and interlocking arms. As each tier rose, the official confirmed height and stability, counting upward. By the 6th level, adjustments were already visible: small shifts in footing, uneven spacing, but the structure held. Daniel stayed near the base as a spotter, watching the alignment. He had already warned that the top tiers would be the weakest: too many variables, not enough shared timing. Still, the climb continued. At the 7th level, a climber near the top placed a foot slightly off-center. It wasn't dramatic, just enough to tilt their balance. That shift transferred downward, forcing the tiers below to compensate. The official paused briefly, watching for stability, but didn't call it off. The correction didn't settle. Instead, the upper section began to lean. The structure held for a moment. Then, the alignment broke. The pyramid didn't drop as one piece. It fractured. Upper tiers peeled away first, bodies falling outward in different directions. The collapse spread unevenly, creating multiple impact points instead of a single downward fall. Daniel stepped forward as it started, trying to intercept the falling athletes. One body struck his upper chest, driving him backward. Before he could regain his footing, a second athlete fell from above and collided directly with his head and neck. The impact was forceful and direct. His head snapped backward and he dropped immediately. There was no attempt to brace, no reflex to break the fall. He lost consciousness on impact. Around him, the remaining tiers collapsed fully. Athletes hit the ground in overlapping falls, some rolling clear, others pinned briefly before pulling away. Within seconds, the entire structure was down. Staff and trainers rushed in. Someone called emergency services while others cleared space around Daniel. He remained unresponsive, with no visible movement. First responders arrived within minutes and took over, stabilizing his neck and attempting resuscitation during transport. He never regained consciousness. The medical report later confirmed a catastrophic cervical spine injury caused by blunt force trauma to the head and neck. The force of the impact disrupted the upper spinal cord, immediately affecting breathing and consciousness. The cause of death was ruled accidental. Investigators reviewed the attempt in detail: how the height was measured, how teams were coordinated, and how stability checks were handled between tiers. The officials' checklist showed the structure had nearly reached its target height. Daniel's own notes were also examined. In them, he had already identified the top levels as the most likely point of failure, not because of strength, but because of timing, balance, and the lack of shared experience across teams. Out of all the cases, this one is harder to process, not because it was reckless, but because he understood the risk and still couldn't step outside it. It failed exactly where it was most likely to, and that's what makes it unsettling. Because in the next story, the weak point isn't structure, it's judgment right at the edge. It was August 17, 2014, at the cliffs of Moher. Before sunrise, the air was cold and damp, and the wind kept shifting along the edge of the cliff. A small group stood near the drop, while waves crashed into the rocks below in uneven patterns, making the water harder to read from above. Today, Arman Petrov, 23, is preparing for a documented high dive attempt. His goal is clear: exceed 197 feet and log it as his highest completed jump. He's from Yekaterinburg, and he approaches it methodically. He keeps a small notebook of previous heights, body positions, and entry angles, and his group uses a handheld rangefinder to confirm the drop before each jump. By mid-2014, Arman had been traveling across Europe with a small group of independent jumpers, moving between known cliff locations without permits or formal safety support. At this site, he focused on a section they measured at just over 197 feet, slightly higher than his previous recorded dive. One of his friends stood back with a camera and his notes, documenting the attempt and calling out the confirmed height. Even though jumping there wasn't allowed, Arman decided to go ahead. They moved in before sunrise to avoid being seen, following a narrow, uneven path along the cliff edge. The ground shifted underfoot, and the wind came in inconsistent bursts. None of it seemed extreme alone, but together it made footing and timing less predictable. At the edge, Arman checked what he could. He watched the water, trying to pick a clear entry point and read the surface movement. From that height, depth perception was limited, and the timing of the swell was harder to judge. The wind felt manageable, but it came in short, uneven gusts. He went through his routine, breathing, posture, visualizing a straight feet-first entry, but rushed the final setup. He stepped forward without fully resetting his footing or waiting for a steady break in the wind. I looked into how these dives are usually done, and people take their time. They check the wind, study the water, and build up to the height. Here, all of that was gone. It came down to one jump with no room for mistakes. His takeoff was slightly off-center. It wasn't obvious at first, but it carried into the fall. As he dropped, a crosswind along the cliff rotated his upper body forward. Without a clean vertical line from the start, he couldn't fully correct it. The deviation grew gradually as he fell. From that height, even a small angle becomes critical. As he approached the water, his body was no longer aligned for a vertical entry. His torso had rotated forward and his legs trailed slightly behind. Instead of entering feet first, he struck the water at an angle, his side and upper body hitting first. The impact was high speed and non-vertical. His chest and shoulder took the force, snapping his head forward and then back on contact. The sudden deceleration was transmitted through his neck and upper spine, causing immediate loss of consciousness before he went under. The people with him saw the entry and knew it was wrong. He didn't resurface with any control. They called for help from the cliff, but reaching the water directly wasn't possible from where they stood. Rescue teams were later deployed and recovered him below. By the time he was brought out, there were no signs of responsiveness. The findings later confirmed he died from severe blunt force trauma consistent with a high-speed, angled water impact. The injuries to his chest, neck, and upper spine matched a non-vertical entry, where the body absorbs force across a wider surface instead of cutting cleanly into the water. At the inquest, attention focused on the crosswinds along the cliff and how difficult they were to judge from above. His recorded notes and measured heights were reviewed, showing he had been systematically tracking each jump. No charges were filed. His notebook was returned to his family, filled with numbers, angles, and targets that, at that height, still depended on conditions he couldn't fully control.